apparently. Welcome again to Refracted Light Presents. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome Right Worshipful Brother, Oscar Allen from the Grand Lodge of New York, who is going to give us a fascinating presentation on the goings-on between Masonic Templarism and chivalric Masonry and all these things that we think we know what they mean, but we probably don't. So at this point, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to yield the mic to Brother Oscar, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat box. I'm going to keep everybody muted until he's done, and then we can continue the conversation. So, Brother Oscar, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you this evening and for your patience, of course, as we navigate the interwebs. Let me get the screen up here. And I provided at least some slides just to walk us through some elements, but this is obviously going to be a conversation of sorts as well. So share screen, and here we go. So now you saw, Joe, I was taking a little bit of time. I had to find the right, graphical representation.
Good one.
So I figured, why not start with a good Monty Python? So when you think about this particular topic, and we kind of label it, where's the beef, and a nightly edition, and this is really an effort to tell multiple sides of a story. So now you saw, Joe, I was taking a little bit of time. I had to find the right, graphical representation.
Good one.
So I figured, why not start with a good Monty Python? So when you think about this particular topic, and we kind of label it, where's the beef, and a nightly edition, and this is really an effort to tell multiple sides of a story. And with that, I think it's important to start with somewhat of, I would say, the beginning, for lack of a better word. So for the beginning, for the sake of understanding this conversation, I would point you to the German Rite of strict observance. This was created by Baron von Hahn in around 1751, or I should say proliferated by Baron von Hahn. You see, Baron von Hahn was, from Germany, lack of a better word, and he was made a Mason. And he was around that time where Masonry was, of course, proliferating, especially that of German Masonry habits its influence from France, and this whole perspective of coming into Germany and being able to grow this particular Masonic edifice. And he had some others that predated him to some extent, but under his particular guidance, he was able to create what was termed as the Rite of strict observance. And what is ironic about this was that the component of this description of this Rite of strict observance, he actually called Rectified Masonry, in an attempt to, I would say, fix, massage, to make better in some regard. So he took the high grades that he had as a professor been exposed to, and it is alleged that he has said that his order was handed to him directly by the Bonnie Prince, as they would say, who was from the Stuarts that were essentially exiled in France. But he was able to grow this particular order, and it became one of the most popular orders within Freemasonry, especially in the German, Austrian, and even we see its impetus into France. Now, it was organized in this basic fashion. You had apprentice, fellowcraft, master mason, Scots master, novice, and knight. Now, one would say, well, wait a minute, knight, that means it's Knight Templar. The irony that I think oftentimes from the American Masonic perspective is that when we say knight, we only think of one particular group. It must be the Knights Templar. And ironically, as we would say, Masonic Knights Templarism, one can argue, have no historical connection to the actual Knights Templar. I mean, probably people are burning their, and getting upset that how dare I say such a thing. But when you look at the historical level where the Knights Templars were, the poor soldiers of Christ, and how they essentially grew and spread. Of course, the story of the Crusades, they did exist, and yes, as we know, they were essentially suppressed, and the order is said to have been died out or maybe escaped to portions of Scotland, etc., and proliferated therein. But in reality, the modern day Templarism that we see are just, to some extent, I would say, revivalists, meaning they assign or ascribe the storyline, the mythos, the essence to, adopt those same principles and apply them to day-to-day aspect. But going back to the 1700s, you actually had men who were really members of royalty and technically had those titles of knights. And then, of course, this is one of the benefits that we found of why Freemasonry spread so easily in France, was that people love titles. Guess what? That hasn't changed. And to some extent, Freemasonry having these fanciful titles and these different orders and these high grades, Knight of the East and the West, Knight of this, Knight of that, Knight of the sword, all of these things were very attractive and really help with its spread and its development. Now, I point you also to Collectanea, Volume 21, Part 1. Yes, because I am a member of the Grand College of Rites, and you can call this a tacit, advertisement to some extent. But if you want to learn any of the rituals that, especially that were available, that have been printed, Collectanea does have a few of these, but the one that I would say you would probably get a better understanding as far as what was published is Volume 21, Part 1, as you start to think about just how the rite of strict observance was grown and what the degree system looked like. Now, why do I start with the rite of strict observance? Because of this knightly perspective, this chivalric, the Templar motif that was used in this particular group, we find another aspect that folks, will need to know. You see, part of Baron von Hund's specter between this particular growth of this rite was that there was some unknown superior that was essentially calling all the shots and given this great opportunity to learn these secrets and to grow and to increase one's status in society and through the Masonic endeavors. And it came a point in time where people started to call his bluff. It's like, okay, who are these unknown superiors? Where is this person? What evidence? Put your money in your mouth. And as a result, he wasn't able to, and folks just really got upset and decided that this is it. We got led down the errant path. Now, what transpired, however, is that one of the gentlemen who was a member of the Rite of Strict Observance decided to rework the rituals. His name was Jean-Baptiste Willermoz. Some people may have heard his name before, but he was actually located in Lyon in France. And what he essentially did at the convent, the Grand Convocation, or the assembly of the Rite of Strict Observance Knights, etc., was that he instituted some revisions. And especially as this order was really being closed down, for lack of a better word, he said, and he presented and was actually accepted, this revision, which essentially transformed the Rite of Strict Observance, this Templar, chivalric order, into the rectified Scottish Rite. Once again, the continuation of this concept of a rectified Mason. And with that, we see that he had the first 3 grades of the rectified Rite, which similarly entered apprentice, master, fellow craft, and master mason. And then he used the same inner order perspective that was shown in the Rite of Strict Observance and retooled them. Particularly, one thing that he did, he changed this perspective of there being a Knights Templar connection and used the outer images of a chivalric knight, but the inner workings was really that of focusing on being a knight, as they would say, beneficent of the holy city. Focusing, in lack of a better word, those who were not really proficient in French, really is saying a benevolent knight, one who is focused on the New Jerusalem, connecting back to the Creator, and really focusing on his inner temple to accomplish the goal, and not that of the outer, let's go on this crusade and reclaim the physical city of Jerusalem. So that's important for you to understand how this rectified Scottish Rite came into being and came into existence. Now, the interesting thing of this rectified Scottish Rite is that it was based on some foundational themes. That of theosophy, which really is a philosophical or religious thought based on this mystical insight of the divine nature. What do all those fancy words mean? Technically, that the goal of the rite, the foundational elements that he has his influence, Willimos did with folks like Martin Pasquale, and then you have others like Louis-Claude Saint-Martin. The idea is that there is this focus on man to connect back to his creator, because man needs to acknowledge that he has fallen from grace by virtue of taking in the original sin or these sins. And there's his man's desire and his goal to perfect himself in Freemasonry, and or in the sense of the rectified rite, towards transforming and reconnecting back to the creator, to, if I can use this term pejoratively, back into the matrix. The other element of that is that of theurgy, or the operation of, the divine, evidence of man and the stat or God, or I should say, or supreme being in the affairs of humanity. So those are the foundational themes that you will find that exist within this rectified Scottish Rite as a basis for how Willimos both revise the rite of strict observance and change those elements that may have an outward perception of one thing, but actually has multiple meanings that are layered within its teachings. Now, I say all of that, and people say, "Well, wait a minute. Did Willimos create the Scots Master Grade? Because you just said that it was in the rite of strict observance, and so how did he?" So let me just clarify a couple things. We do know that the Scots Master Degree did exist before all of this stuff happened. If you go back into this old school, as we would say, depiction of the several lodges that met in London at the time and across England, we see that lodge number 115 met at the tavern, or as they say, Devil and St. Dunstan, because of the sign of the saint tweaking the devil's nose in his pincers. And this lodge met close to on Fleet Street, close to the Temple Bar in London, where we find the earliest records of it existing roughly around 1733, being later erased in 1736. Now, why is that all important? Once again, if you go through Collectania and some of these other documents that exist, we can find references to the Scots Master Grade, whether it's in the 1742 called English Écossais or Perfect English Master, or the Perfect Elect Master, or Grand Écossais, or the Trondheim manuscript in 1752. The point here is that this grade existed. And it was basically utilized not only in the rite of strict observance, but transferred it over into the rectified Scottish Rite. So it wasn't invented by Willimos. Remember, what Willimos did was basically try to add his particular embellishments and infuse his foundational themes in the outer shell of what was existing as the rite of strict observance, and reforming that into the rectified Scottish Rite. Now, with that said, what happened with the rectified Scottish Rite? So France, essentially Lyon, became the center of this new organization, and a couple things happened. In a few of those conventions that were held, as usual, Masons don't always agree. So the German brothers said, "You know what? We don't like what you did. We don't like these revisions. We're going to take our stuff, go home back to Germany, and we're going to essentially do our own version of our rectified Masonic order." And we have actually seen this comparative group that existed within Germany, within their own system, and developing what was seeing similar themes, but independent of the infusions that Willimos did. At the same token, we then had another major catastrophe happen, which was the French Revolution and the persecution, of course, of several members of society, including Willimos and others, by virtue of, the French Revolution, and of course the all famous guillotine and the suppression of Freemasonry and other things to that extent. So the rectified Scottish Rite moved from its mother origin, that of Lyon, into Helvetia, which is Switzerland. because the order still existed in Switzerland. The lodges were there. They obviously didn't suffer from the French Revolution. So we see this transfer for quote unquote the mother council going into Helvetia. And Helvetia, by that virtue, has become the longest lasting rectified Scottish Rite group, and essentially has utilized that opportunity to repopulate the rectified Scottish Rite around the world. And in so doing, we see that the Great Priory was created in America in 1934, the Great Priory of Rectified Scottish Rite, CBCS, in England and Wales in 1937, 2008. I'm going to get to that in a minute. There's actually a 1900s connection point. There is the Great Priory of Belgium, Portugal, Togo, France, which also, France has some, scenarios here as well. And then you have Brazil, Spain, Italy, Austria, and Benin. Now, why is all this important? This basically illustrates the point that when you look at what is regarded as regular and recognized rectified Scottish Rite, you find that in these great priories that exist. Another aspect that, before I go to that slide, I actually must add one additional point. There are two lineages that one would find with rectified Scottish Rite and what we call CBCS, in the sense of using the same terms, together. Let's say rectified Scottish Rite and CBCS. One is, of course, this Masonic level that I just described to you with the regular recognized group, and the other is under the other, I would say, esoteric order called Martinism. And Martinism is, of course, a group of philosophical perspective and an esoteric order in many regards that is also traced to the same foundational elements of the rectified Scottish Rite, because Willernos, as well as Saint Martin, as well as Pasquale, were all kind of called somewhat of the founders of Martinism. So as a result of that, we find that, of course, Willernos had taken elements of one of his particular mystical orders called Eleucoin and integrated and infused elements of that into the Masonic rectified Scottish Rite. So as a result, Martinist groups or Martinist entities also would be known and have been known to practice an element of the CBCS, but under the umbrella of being Martinist. So you can have, or you can be in a Martinist order and actually go through the CBCS and rectified grades, much like you would in the Masonic regular side. But because they are not Masonic, the two aren't necessarily, mutually exclusive, but they are not necessarily angry at each other's existence, if you understand what I mean. They coexist without any issue, because one's Masonic and one's Martinist, and no one really cares between the two. Now, which brings me to this particular conversation as far as why is this even important as we talk about this issue of this battle between the U.S. chivalric orders. You see, in 1934, two gentlemen from America traveled to Switzerland to become initiated into the rectified Scottish Rite. There were two previous attempts that occurred, one in the 1800s by Robert Folger, which didn't go well because he was tied mostly to a regular Scottish Rite Supreme Council at the time, with the battles between Cerno and everything else in New York. Then you found in 1900s, a dentist by the name of Edward Blitz was able to receive the order and was championed to deliver it to the U.S. Bliss actually also is the father of Martinism in America, so he was able to spread Martinism, and he did spread the Rectified Scottish Rite, or CBCS, for a number of years, but over a period of time, it essentially went away. So then we find 1934, Ray Schutz and Aaron Moseley Bond go to Switzerland, and they become initiated into the rectified Scottish Rite, which they then use to form, 1934, the Great Priory of America. Now, those of you who are in other groups such as AMD, Knight Masons, KYCH, and those other elements, these are all the same groups that these men helped founded, and they're actually called the innovators of Freemasonry for their delivery of these different elements of Freemasonry into the American culture and the American lexicon. So why am I talking about these men in that regard? So they received the rituals, they received the initiation, and they came back to America, and they proliferated them. Now, I say that because the Great Prior of America is described oftentimes as this big supper club, and there's no this is just an image representation. I don't know whether or not there's an actually pinkies being raised, as a person who likes being dressed. I'm upset there's no bow tie on this gentleman, but either which way, it's just a representation. So the question becomes, did Shute and those folks, when they brought this group into America, make it a supper club? In actuality, they did not. They initiated other men. They conducted the degrees. But what did happen over a course of time, we found that there was this transformation, or I should say, this transformation of this actual working of the degrees into it being an elite, very much invitation only, but essentially a who's who of Masonic leadership and select Masonic leadership across the U.S. So you hear names like, Voorhees. You hear names of some of these men that we have heard or read about. In some cases, make sense. In other cases, we're like, oh, I had no clue. So we find that this essentially existed as what folks would say in American Freemasonry as being the ne plus ultra, meaning if you or anyone who's anyone, you have arrived when you get invited into the GPA. And this perspective of the supper club, whether or not it was true or not, because of course, it wasn't, for folks who would go to Masonic Week and maybe see or hear whispers and see folks dressed a certain way, and of course, not necessarily having that both that visibility or that understanding, the perception was one that for a number of years that it may have transformed into this supper club where folks didn't do the degrees and basically just held the title of CBCS without any of the participation that is taught within the foundational themes that I just discussed. Which brings us to what transpired in and around the late 2000s. You see, the GPA as it existed was challenged by, at the time, the leadership of the Grand Encampment of the USA. Grand Encampment, for those, meaning the national body that governs the Knight Templar degree or Knight Templar orders. And the leader at that time insisted that the GPA should not exist because they were infringing on the sovereign territory of the Grand Encampment of Knights Templar USA, because in their impression they were a Templar order. And the justification being is that in other portions of the world where Knights Templar as an entity doesn't exist, the CBCS does, and they are recognized by other Knights Templar orders as being equivalent equivalent of the Knights Templar. And one of the other statements that was made was that on the charters of the folks who are in the CBCS, there's this French Latin phrase called Order Templar, which means Templar order, which means they're Knights Templar. Now, that being said, there was resolutions basically drawn that stated that membership in the Great Prior of America was inconsistent with membership in the Grand Encampment USA. And individuals who held membership in both had to give up one, either resign from Templary or resign from the GPA. Quite harsh. especially given that over 87 years had transpired, as I mentioned, where the group existed, coexisted, and had shared membership, including Grand Masters of Grand Encampment, who also were heads of the Great Prior of America. So then there was an additional decision made that was clarified by the next one of the following Grand Masters of Grand Encampment, which basically said that individuals who maintained membership were subject to expulsion to some extent under the Grand Encampment rules for violation of their knightly vows. Something else happened. The Grand Encampment also, after going into this particular element, also went on a very strong messaging campaign. In each of their magazines, you found that there were statements made to declare its position that the Great Prior of America was illegitimate and a Templar order and infringed upon their sovereignty. And then we find that members of the Grand Encampment, through its leadership, also traveled to France to become members of the CBCS under a French order called the Great Priory of Rectified Scottish Rite in Aquitania. And they showed them going to Marseille, being inducted in a cavern receiving the CBCS grades, and then in turn granting orders for Knights Templary on the members of the French group that created this particular, or helped them get initiated. And the goal was for them to come back to America and create their own CBCS under the umbrella of the Grand Encampment, which then made it easy for members of the Grand Encampment to be able to participate and be attracted to the Rectified Scottish Rite because of that umbrella organization, which will then, of course, help to snuff or reduce the presence of the Great Prior of America of 1934. Now, what gets really confusing is that this Great Priory was called the Great Priory of the United States of America, which, of course, if you think the Great Prior of America, USA, people could obviously confuse the two. So here's an interesting thing, however, that I think is important for people to understand, because most people had no clue, didn't understand what this is about, or I would say can defend most of the argument one way or the other. So one of the things that's interesting when you read the constitutions of the Great Grand Encampment of Knights Templar of USA, they actually state that their sole jurisdiction is over the grades of Christian, or the orders of Christian knighthood known as Red Cross, Knights of Malta, and Knight Templar. In fact, they said that their supreme legislative, judicial, executive, and jurisdiction over the orders of Red Cross, Knight of Malta, Knight Templar, within the United States and geography where it exercises jurisdiction. Now, apples and oranges, the degree system that William Rose created were what? Entered apprentice, fellowcraft, master mason, Scots master, squire novice, and knight beneficent of the Holy City. None of those are Order of the Red Cross, Knight of Malta, Knights Templar. So the question then becomes, well, what exactly are we arguing here about? What is the reality? Is the CBCS and the GPA a Knight Templar body? Or is it just another chivalric order like many of the other orders that exist where, they essentially enjoy their existence and don't necessarily bother anyone else? Now, I say that because I saw in this document that was presented, which I know I posted somewhere, I think Wine Staircase or in All Things Masonic, the interesting argument came up about this concept of Templary and chivalric orders. And if one takes a hard look at the appendant, concordant, and invitational bodies, you'll find a few things. In the accepted Scottish Rite, especially in the Knights Kadosh and a few of the other orders that we would say in the North that fall into the consistory, or even in the 18th degree Knight of the Rose Croix, you're hearing a couple things. This concept of knight. So the image of a knight is not only germane to that of being in the Knights Templar, right? So we see in the Scottish Rite there exists degrees, Knight of St. Andrew, Knight of the Rose Croix, Knights of Kadosh, etc. And there isn't an issue there about the existence. We know that the Grand Council of Knight Masons, to all the fellow cousins out there, do have this concept of being knights as well. We know that in the Order of the Red Branch of Erie, which is under the Allied Masonic degree, one also obtains grades which are designated as being knights. You recognize that in the Royal Order of Scotland, the grades that are there conferred also confers one with this perception and concept of being a knight, a chivalric knight, a Masonic knight. We know the same exists with the Red Cross of Constantine, and even in another Allied Masonic degree called, or organized under Allied Masonic degree, which is the Masonic Knights of the Scarlet Cord, Royal Order of the Masonic Knights of the Scarlet Cord. So this perception of there being only one group in the U.S. who controls Masonic knighthood isn't necessarily the case. I'm just not being facetious, but just stating the facts. So, which brings us to the triennial that we heard a little bit about and didn't know exactly, what was the big deal. And it was mentioned, what were some of the issues therein. Now, this triennial held out in the Midwest, essentially had a couple of resolutions. And I'm just going to touch on two of these resolutions as they pertain to this conversation and why either is there a degree of importance or why should any of us care about this particular scenario. One of these resolutions was to basically identify that the Great Prior of America, CBCS, was a lawful independent body, and that this perspective that it is a Templar order needs to be done away with, and more specifically, that the decision made in 2012 to essentially make it illegal or to say that there is no recognition or say that the body shouldn't exist or that it's a Templar order should be rescinded. And this particular resolution passed by an over 77% vote of the delegates assembled. So that in of itself was crazy, because here you have, since 2000, the late 2000s, 2010, 2011, 2012, up until now, this battle, this fight over predominantly in leadership of the Grand Encampment and leadership of this other group, over the existence. And it was all based on this resolution. And here we find the delegates of the Grand Encampment voted as a sovereign body to put things to bed and essentially buried a particular hatchet. The other thing that was of equal importance was another resolution, number 26, which essentially stated that the CBCS was declared a Templar body, and therefore anyone who held membership in it that was also a member of the Grand Encampment, should receive automatic expulsion for violating their knightly vows. And that got essentially defeated by the delegates and said, no, we disagree with this resolution. So we have this particular perspective of, is there peace, love, and harmony that is prevailing? And who cares about all this stuff, right? Is this a matter of grown men in Masonic cosplay, believing that they are knights and believing that they are protectors of some honor or vow that need to essentially draw swords against each other and fight to the bloody end? And essentially focus on things such as lawsuits or taking honors away from people or expelling people. Are all of these things portion of what is called the Masonic etiquette, the Masonic milieu, or I should even say, dare the expression, are they Christian in the level of, one would say, the lesson of Christianity, specifically of, love, unconditional love for one's fellow man and neighbor. So I put all of this together just to engage in this conversation, Joe. And I hope, of course, that I at least presented as multiple sides of the coin as possible, not to be biased in any way, shape, or form, but at least to if I did exist, if I did present any bias, forgive me. I think some of this stuff just I think becomes childish in some way, shape, or form. But it actually leads true to true Masonic form, as we see historically Masons, for some reason or another, in the spirit of brotherly love, sometimes just can't seem to get along.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Brother Oscar. That was fantastic. I'm definitely going to unmute everybody because I'm sure people have questions and comments and discussion. Folks, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves as you see fit. Please do not all scream at once. I'm going to let you unmute yourself. I'm actually going to be stingy and ask the first question, which is probably the lamest question to ask, but I've always found it interesting. Brother Oscar, why did they in Europe, why did they feel there needed to be a rectified rite? What was it that they were trying to rectify in and of itself? Because, speculative Freemasonry had only been around for a couple of decades by that time. So what broke that needed to be fixed?
Excellent question. So one of the things I think is important to realize, and this is another confusing point that I didn't touch on, but I was hoping we can discuss it in the conversation. Even this concept of Scottish Rite. For us, Scottish Rite means the 33 degrees. So rectified Scottish Rite, are you trying to fix the 33 degrees? Has nothing to do with the Scottish Rite, other than the term écossais. Right? So rectified Scottish Rite is basically Régime de Rite écossais, which basically is French for Scottish. So the term Scottish, or the high grades, the haut grade, as we know, the haut grade, as we know, French Masonry really proliferated, consisted of the Rose Croix, the Philosophical Rite, the Rite of Memphis, the this order, that order. There are all these different definitive orders being created. So in Willermose's perspective, what he was really trying to accomplish, and looking at where he was and his proliferation, both of his order and his or the opportunity to proliferate his Martinist order, while also focus on the work that he was doing in Freemasonry. I believe, and this is Oscar's opinion, I believe that he, in understanding his belief system around man's duty, is in reconnecting back to his God, reconnected back to his creator. That when we look at the elements of Freemasonry, there is this value for trying to realign Freemasonry to be more than just about, well, we have this ritual, we have this order, but that we can translate it, or I should say transform it into a divine path that allows for this consecration, so one can become a true spiritual knight for the existence of humanity, and also for humanity's reconnection back to God. So in that is that play on words, both on the rectified Masonry that von Hoon was first trying, and then using that as this kind of a double entendre, right? Saying one thing but meaning something else, or adding these additional layers. That's my belief as to what the relevance was for the rectified Mason. So even within the 3 grades that they confer, there's some unique things that he changes, that he adapts. So if you are in the rectified Rite under the craft lodge system, and several Grand Lodges actually do confer those systems. You have France, Spain, Switzerland, and Belgium, and I believe Quebec, where there are, and Brazil, I'm sorry, can't forget Brazil, and Brazil, where there are lodges of the rectified Rite, meaning the first 3 grades. In order to get 4, 5, and 6, and anything else, you have to go into the CBCS, the great priories for that. In the US, none of those 3 grades are worked, because the 3 grades of Masonry are always under the jurisprudence and the ownership of the Grand Lodge. So just let me clarify that. So you find that there are these changes that were made, and you can see them in similar to passwords that are changed around, and some of the stories that are put around. So even though they have the shell of Enter the Apprentice Fellowcraft Master Mason, Willermose redesigned his particular pathway to make sure everything is connected. The only place that I have seen such connection has been in the Swedish Rite system, where whatever you start in the beginning, everything you learn is tied to what you go through and see at the end. So it's a continual pathway that goes through uninterrupted. And that's what he additionally did within his Rectified Rite. So I would say that perfection, that rectification is what he was attempting.
Fantastic. And yeah, you brought up a couple of points there that I just wanted to touch on. So, what you were saying that von Hund and some other folks wanted to bring back to Masonry and rectify it, no pun intended, was that sense of humanity has fallen, which is a very Martinist way of thinking. And they definitely expanded on that later. The trifecta of dudes who wrote a lot in French.
And there's the thing. I'm sorry to cut you off, but without saying it expressly. That's the thing that's interesting about it. One could argue, and you've heard French Masons and even French Martinists say that you can be in the Rectified Rite without being Martinist, meaning that you're not necessarily professing the Martinist perspective. It's kind of like the best of both worlds. So he delivered it in such a way, and it was maintained. It really has been unchanged for centuries, teaching those lessons without necessarily being overtly, even though it was intrinsically tied in. Sorry.
No, no worries. No, that was a great footnote. And you brought up the Swedish Rite. Now, the Swedish Rite, they are one of the few grand jurisdictions that are specifically only catering to a certain faith group. Is that correct?
So they're not the only ones, but the Swedish Rite system, and I have a talk on that probably could do later. Not now, of course. The Swedish Rite, does have this particular element of them that's tied to the fact that there's this, state religion that exists in those particular countries that one must be a Christian. What is ironic, though, especially when American Masons hear that, including myself at first, it's like, oh, that's not Masonry. That's not open to all denominations. Not necessarily recognizing that our view of Christianity and our concept of a dogmatic Christianity, which we're mostly familiar with, was not the perspective that they had or they hold over in those particular countries. And I've been in Iceland. I've been in Norway, and actually seen and was walked through the different systems. It's a beautiful system, and even part of the elements, without me giving too much away because of the open audience, they actually do challenge the aspirant, the candidate, to say, well, do they believe that their religion is better than everyone else? And if they do say yes, they get admonished for it, because even though there's this requirement because of the quote state religion or that perspective, it's not one that is dogmatic, and they would emphatically tell you their right, though there has this Christian requirement, does not mean that it's dogmatic. It's dogmatic to that extent, not dogmatic, dogmatic. Now, the other side is they also recognize that part of that is by virtue of their own particular isolation, right? Usually, unless you are from that particular country, you're not trying to join Freemasonry there, and they haven't necessarily had an influx of, at the time, an influx of other particular religions or other diversities and inclusion to that extent. There are a number of those grand lodges now that are actively exploring ways to provide a corollary system, whether it's, let's say, the English style or whatever, to allow membership in Freemasonry within their umbrella, without necessarily saying that it's Christian owned.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, brother. Brethren, friends, family, feel free to unmute your mics and regale Brother Oscar with your questions. I'm going to start calling people. Brother Michael.
Good evening, Oscar. As always, that was phenomenal. Has the Grand Encampment ever had a history of singling out another group like this for this anathema that they proclaimed against CBCS, or is this the first time that ever happened?
In recent history, not as far as I can tell. Other than, I think there was in 1866, 67, there was this big beef between the Scottish Rite, which was being formed at that time, being pushed and proliferated by Albert Pike. And the Grand Master at that time of Grand Encampment pretty much said, hey, you guys are growing this Scottish Rite system. We actually feel that you should only be providing membership in the Scottish Rite to guys that are in Knights Templar because of the fact that you have these chivalric, or as they would say in American parlance, Templar orders that exist within the Scottish Rite. So really, we don't have a problem with you doing it. We just require that you can only permit people who are members of Knights Templar to join. And Pike pretty much said, no, I think I'm going to go my way and just open it up to everyone. And that became another battle of egos, who basically, felt that they had the bigger set of knighthood, and essentially led to folks expelling each other, and then essentially, burying the hatchet, I guess, years later. So I think from the perspective of the historical lens, those were the two touch points that I can recall, historically speaking. There may be others, but historically speaking, there hasn't been this much of an attack of one group versus the other. Now, ironically, we also recognize that there may have been a third scenario, that of course, the Brothers of Prince Hall, who, of course, have their Masonic Knights Templar, and the question then becomes, the period of time where they were not recognized as such, and whether or not there were attacks on them as being illegitimate as well by the Grand Encampment, until, of course, later on being some resolution in more recent time frames. So those are the three elements that I would possibly surmise as my best answer to other groups that have been on, I guess, the bleeding edge of the sword.
Excellent. Thank you.
Oscar.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't know if you can hear me or not. My question's kind of probably silly, but how does the Grand Encampment of the United States just claim ownership over something like the title of knighthood and try to hold that over the heads of people like CBCS and other orders? Like, are they directly gifted this from Grand Lodge of England? How does this go about, where they get to a place where they say, it's this or that or nothing?
You threw not a silly question at me. You threw a very difficult question, because I cannot speak for any of the leadership or membership of the Grand Encampment with any degree of authority as to why they believe they had that authority. I can only point you to the language that was disseminated by them in their Knights Templar magazine and a few others, where essentially it was proclaimed that all this is predicated on I'm being polite. All this is predicated, the justification, let me say it this way. The justification was predicated on the fact that who controls the Templar orders within the United States of America and beyond, in the jurisdiction to that extent. And as we know in Grand Lodges, we say Grand Lodge owns the degrees of Ensign, Apprentice, Fellowcraft, Master Masons. Grand Encampment owns the orders of the Red Cross, Malta, and of course Knight Templar, right? That's very expressly stated within their constitutions. The use of this perspective that, hey, CBCS is here, and we, meaning the Grand Encampment, recognized CBCS in 1927 when they found out that England and others were getting into amity with Helvetia and exchanging representatives with Helvetia. Grand Encampment said, we want to do it too. And for a number of years, they reached out to Helvetia and they exchanged representative or grand representatives between the two groups. Then, of course, that started in 1927, 1934. Then we find the Great Prior of America being created by Helvetia. no one, and if you read their proceedings, no one ever said there's a problem with this, or hey, you guys are violating your knightly vows. You are conferring Templar orders. None of that was ever done back then. So I think my best answer to you, it was a convenient excuse or a convenient reasoning on how you choose to utilize the language, or interpret the language to go after the group for other salient needs. And that's just my observation. But terrific questions. Way to get me on the ropes the first out the swing.
So I have what's definitely a dumb question. So if the Grand Encampment, let's say they went to the UK, and there they have their Knights Templar are called the Priory, right?
Yes. So the Knights Templar, and the Knights, it has a much longer name, but technically the way Knights Templar is organized in England and Wales is the Great Priory there of Knights Templar,
Of
which
Knights
is
Templar.
different from the Great Priory of KBHC, which is the CBCS of England. They're two different groups.
Okay, so if the CBCS in the US went to a priory conclave in the UK and the Grand Encampment were there, they still recognized, other countries still recognized the Grand Priory in the US, right?
Most certainly. In fact, that has happened where the I'm sorry, Mike, if I misspoke anything, but that has happened where there are meetings, which all the orders are received as such, and in fact the Grand Encampment lists that as a justification for their argument that, well, this just proves that the Great Prior of America is Templar because they were received at this meeting of the Templar orders. And in reality, it's a play on words because, as I mentioned, because Templary, in the sense that we have it, exists in certain countries, it never proliferated in others. And in others, they had, the CBCS, and that's what they knew from the beginning. So the fact that they may be a sister organization that is chivalric, that is recognized as such, doesn't mean that they're saying that order is Templar. So but it was used as that kind of a play to say, well, look, they're pretending to be Templars and they're being received as Templars, so they are a Templar order, so let's shut them down.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Don't be shy. You don't have to raise your hand, Michael. Just start talking.
I don't want to put you on the hot seat again, but with the vote, is the war over, or is this just another round?
I can't speak to that. I would hope that this war is over, but egos are egos, so who knows? Not everyone's happy. So we'll I guess we'll find out. But I'm sure there are better things for us to be fighting about in the given where we are and what's been going on in the world. I'm sure there are more important things to be arguing over.
I can think of 75.
Any more questions? Because brother and Dr. Oscar is a busy dude.
And I appreciate the opportunity to, share and at least provide some of this perspective. As I said, it's a lot. As I said, most of us may not even care about any of this because it doesn't infringe on our existence. But it's always helpful to at least have some awareness as to what's happening, because ultimately, at the end of the day, these things are out in history, and in some way, shape, or form, it's important to at least have some degree of awareness.
Well, I'm glad you did. And to that point, I mean, you're on social media, so am I. You see people just arguing and screaming about stuff. They don't even know what is going on. They just see a buzzword and, the bullets start flying. So, any opportunity to be informed should be a Mason's first duty, right?
Yeah.
But we know it doesn't work out that way. So,
And
Um,
and I always say, you think about things from the level of there being all these different masonry, it's how many baubles you can collect, right? How many titles, how many things, did someone get in or someone didn't get in and therefore they're angry, upset? I don't know. I can say that, ultimately, when we look at the history of Freemasonry in the US and by extension, the history of Freemasonry across the world, there are all these intricate connection points. And there's these developments that at times, are intriguing because when you look at what are aims and goals, the aims and goals of Freemasonry, which you just spoke about, and even the aims and goals that the gentleman who created and revised and redeveloped and revamped this rectified Scottish Rite, this isn't what they were trying to get into, right? This wasn't what they're espousing. If you think about the perspective of the storyline that is delivered through through that of the order of Christian knighthood under the Grand Encampment, it is thought of being a Christian knight, espousing those Christian principles. The orders that are being described under the not the order, the grades are described under the CBCS and the rectified Scottish Rite about, gods, or just say, the concept, what was the phrase that I read? The concept of, the greatest lesson of God, being on earth was that of unconditional love, so focusing on the esoteric spiritual conceptions that help espouse that, and that inner temple that go into basically perfect one's inner temple, which is similar to what we hear in craft masonry, right? We're rebuilding the temple. So these are things that I think ultimately we just have to take stock of, and really ask ourselves, well, why are we really here if this is what we're getting into? If we're getting into beef, I got to be polite here, over nonsense. I was trying to think of another B word to go with my alliteration. But if we're just getting into beef over these things, then what's the point? And I even raised, I think someone corrected me the other day when I made this post. So the Grand Encampment has 70,000 members, right? 70 with 3 other zeros behind. The Great Pride of America has 100. I mean, going back to my first slide with the Monty Python, it just looks weird as a battle, right? Or I should say, maybe it's the the Masonic revival of the movie 300, maybe. I don't
well, we know how that ended, so let's hope it doesn't go that route. Brother Oscar, always a pleasure to have you on here. You did mention something which piqued my curiosity because I love learning things. You said you had a program on the Swedish Rite, so I'll definitely hit you up after this. Facebook world, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to stop the feed and I'm going to stop recording. So if anybody wants to stay on and ask questions you didn't want to ask in public, you'll have your chance. So with that, let me go ahead and kill the feed. Goodbye, Facebook.